Welcome back to another video. So the other week I was out planting some green bean seeds, and I planted them. We had some good rain. I watered it if the soil got dry, and over the course of the next week and a half to 2 weeks, these bean seeds began to sprout up. However, I noticed that about 3/4 of the seeds that I planted either did not come up, or they sprouted and they looked kind of sickly or chewed up. And so I wondered what was going on, because these bean seeds have gotten ample water, and so I was wondering what was causing these issues. So I did a bit of research and I realized that the bean seed maggot can oftentimes be the culprit of infesting these bean seeds as they sprout and eating them out. To a point where many of them don't sprout, and the ones that are able to survive don't look very good. So these bean seed maggots do have an important job, right? They break down the organic matter in the soil and turn it into more soil-like substances. And this is just part of the natural decomposition process. Unfortunately, bean seeds are technically organic matter, and so when the maggots find these, particularly the bean seed maggot, it could result in crop loss, yield loss, and things like that. Now, there is a seasonality to this. The adult flies, which look a lot like a common housefly, will end up laying their eggs in the fall. The eggs overwinter and they hatch in the spring, and those maggots start feeding on the organic matter. They find the bean seeds, and then you get yield loss and things like that. Also, a few months ago when I was planting peas in the garden, I noticed that hardly any of them came up as well. Of course, right after I planted those pea seeds, we didn't get rain for like a month and a half. So that may have had something to do with it as well. But also, when you're planting these legumes like peas or beans earlier on in the season, that means they take a lot more time to germinate, to sprout up and to emerge out of the ground. So with this delayed, this slowed process of sprouting, it gives even more of an opportunity to these maggots to find the beans, or the peas in this case, and eat them out. Essentially, any conditions that are going to delay or slow germination of these seeds will ultimately have a very high risk of resulting in yield loss and crop loss later on in that season. So on that note, it can be advantageous to wait and plant your peas later, or plant your beans later. So here in Zone 6A, I've always used to plant peas around March 17th. Unfortunately, that's still kind of early, right? It's kind of cool, and the germination of the peas will be a little delayed. And I've noticed that I've had really bad germination for these pea plants the last few years, and so that might have something to do with it. So I may wait a few weeks, maybe towards the end of March, probably actually the beginning of April, and plant the peas then. I know a local farmer who has developed a tradition of planting the peas right at the beginning of April, and that way the temperatures are a little bit warmer and the peas take less time to germinate. They will flower a little later in the season, but they can still produce very well, and you have a lot more plants to work with than if you had planted earlier. I also know of another farmer who starts his pea plants in the greenhouse. That way it prevents the maggot infestation, and the plants are already established by the time they're going into the ground. Now, whether or not that method is worth it for you will probably ultimately depend. Now, back to the bean seeds. I should also specify that these bean seeds that I'm talking about are the Blue Lake Bush bean. It's actually a type of green bean, and the distinction, and making the distinction that it's a green bean, is actually kind of important, and I'll circle back to that in a few minutes. So these green bean seeds that I planted in 2 new garden beds. I had previously tilled up the soil about a week and a half, about a week or a few days beforehand, and that can actually be an important factor in this whole thing. Tilling can introduce a whole lot more organic matter deeper into the soil. Organic matter that was previously on the surface, maybe if it was leaf litter or plant residue, and it can incorporate that into the soil. So you get this whole big influx of organic matter, right? This food source for these fly larvae. And so it can create a very prime environment for these larval insects, which may cause problems if you are planting your bean seeds immediately after tilling. Some people like to till a month or two before planting. That way the organic matter gets incorporated into the soil and kind of burnt up by the microbiology in there. And essentially what it's doing is it's destroying the food source for those larval insects. Unfortunately, it's also taking the organic matter out of the equation, which is an important component for having healthy soil and a higher water holding capacity and healthy plants. But you are eliminating the food source that way. If you choose that method, you might have to get creative with adding organic matter back into that soil, boosting photosynthesis, and doing things like that. So hopefully that organic matter level can increase a little bit over the growing season so that you can still have that healthy soil and that healthy plants. Now, another method people will use is to plant their beans and peas later on in the season as well. So not just the peas that I was talking about, and planting those maybe in early April instead of March, at least in this climate where I'm at, can be beneficial. And you can also do that with beans as well. Instead of planting around May 15th, you can wait until the very end of May, very early June, to get those bean seeds in the ground. And the thinking there is that the larvae will begin to pupate and then become flies, right? So they're no longer feeding on that organic matter in the soil. If you're growing bush beans, it might not be as big of a deal to plant later, but if you're growing pole beans, they do require a little bit longer of a season, and it might work for you, it might not, depending on where you live and what type of climate you're working with. Now, another interesting aspect to this whole thing is that I also planted kidney beans in the garden this year as well. And I planted them basically around the same time that I planted these green beans. However, they were planted in untilled, already established garden beds, and they had very excellent rates of germination. And I was looking around at the plants trying to look for any maggot damage, and I could hardly find any at all. So originally I was thinking maybe the lack of tillage, it didn't cause that soil life imbalance, creating what might be an ideal habitat for these maggots, and that may or may not play a role in it, but I'm thinking it's probably not the only factor in this situation. So I took a closer look at those kidney beans that were sprouting out of the ground, and I noticed that many of the leaves were still kind of wrapped up in that tough outer seed coat of that kidney bean seed. The scientific term for that is called a testa. And I pulled off that really thick, tough seed coat from one of them, and I looked at it and I wondered if that might have something to do with the resistance to the larval insects feeding on them. Because it's such a tough, thick, strong coat, right? That seed coat, that testa, is made out of a lot of parenchyma tissue, and it has various biochemical compounds in there like tannins, anthocyanins, and proanthocyanidins, which all work together to help preserve and protect that seed from pests and disease until it sprouts up and begins to grow. Now, when I looked back at the green bean seeds, I noticed that hardly any of them, maybe none of them at all, even had any type of remaining seed coat residue that was still attached to the cotyledons. And looking at the seeds, it seems like that seed coat is actually thinner and not quite as thick and strong as that of the kidney beans. So I'm wondering if that might actually have a role in why the maggots were so easily able to penetrate in the green beans and not in the kidney beans. Now, what some people like to do is they like to take a bowl of soapy water and they put that outside in the garden, and that will collect flies, and each day they count the number of flies in there. And as those numbers of flies begin to decline, then they plant their beans, and then the idea with that is that there will be lower numbers of the larvae in the soil. So on that note, I want to thank you for watching this video. Feel free to check out more of these videos, and take care.